Verrückt, waterslide death. On the 7th of August 2016, 10-year-old Caleb Schwab boarded Verrückt, at the time marketed as the tallest waterslide in the world. Riders were secured in multi-person rafts and sent down a steep drop followed by a second hill designed to create airtime. During Caleb's descent, the raft went airborne on the second crest. He was thrown upward and made contact with overhead metal support structures before the raft continued forward without him. The ride had been constructed under intense pressure to break records. Designers altered specifications repeatedly, testing was informal, and safety calculations were not independently verified by a licensed engineer. Sandbags were used instead of crash test dummies in early trials. When rafts consistently lifted off the track, additional netting and metal poles were installed above the slide to contain riders rather than redesign the structure itself. What failed was not a single bolt or harness. It was the decision to prioritize novelty over physics. The netting meant to protect guests, instead introduced rigid components directly in the path of airborne riders. Caleb died at the scene. 2 other riders in the same raft were injured. Criminal charges were later filed against park operators and designers, though most were eventually dismissed or settled. The ride was demolished. The record it once held is no longer advertised. Six Flags Drop Ride. On the 28th of June 2008, 17-year-old Asia Ferguson visited Six Flags over Georgia and boarded the Superman Tower of Power, a drop tower attraction that lifted riders high above the park before releasing them in a controlled freefall. During the ride cycle, his hat flew off and landed in a restricted area beneath the structure. After exiting the ride, he entered that restricted zone to retrieve it. As another ride cycle began, riders were lifted overhead. When the carriage dropped, Asia was in the fall path. He was struck and killed instantly. The mechanical system functioned as designed. The drop tower descended along a fixed vertical track with significant force and speed. What failed was perimeter control. Fencing and warning signs were present, but the restricted area remained physically accessible. Surveillance did not immediately detect his presence below the ride. There were no automated systems to prevent operation if someone was beneath the drop zone. Investigators concluded that the death resulted from unauthorized entry into a hazardous area. The park settled with the family and reinforced barriers around the ride's base. Operational protocols were reviewed, and signage was updated. The incident did not involve a malfunctioning restraint or structural defect. It involved proximity to machinery designed to move with precision and power. In amusement parks, danger is usually contained within the ride path. When someone steps outside the intended boundary, the containment disappears. Orlando FreeFall. On the 24th of March, 2022, 14-year-old Tyre Sampson boarded the Orlando FreeFall ride at Icon Park in Florida. The attraction lifted riders more than 400 feet into the air before tilting them forward and dropping at high speed. As the ride descended, Tyre slipped from his seat and fell to his death. He had been seated in a position where the safety harness was not fully secured against his body. The ride's restraint system used sensors to determine whether seats were locked. Investigators later found that the sensor parameters for his seat had been manually adjusted to allow a greater opening than originally specified by the manufacturer. This meant the system indicated a secure position, even when the harness gap exceeded safe limits. The ride operator did not perform a secondary manual check that might have identified the problem. There was no redundant physical safeguard to compensate for the altered calibration. The failure was quiet and technical. It did not announce itself until the drop was already underway. A state investigation concluded that the ride had been operating outside manufacturer specifications. Criminal charges were considered against parties involved in the modification. The ride was dismantled within months. The design intended to thrill through controlled freefall. The modification reduced that control by millimeters. In high-speed vertical motion, millimeters are not minor adjustments. They are margins between containment and absence. Texas Giant. On the 19th of July, 2013, 52-year-old Rosa Esparza boarded the Texas Giant, a steel hybrid roller coaster that had been renovated to increase speed and height. During the ride, she was ejected from her seat and fell approximately 75 feet to her death. Witnesses reported hearing her express concern about the restraint before dispatch. The lap bar had locked, but subsequent investigation found it may not have been positioned tightly enough against her body. The ride's restraint system was designed to automatically lock when lowered. However, it did not include a redundant seatbelt or shoulder harness. The train completed its circuit before staff realized what had happened. The failure was not structural collapse. It was the margin between acceptable restraint and insufficient containment. An independent review determined that the restraint design allowed for variability depending on rider body size. The manufacturer later redesigned the restraint system to reduce the gap and added seatbelts as secondary protection. The park settled a lawsuit with the victim's family. The ride continued operating after modifications. The redesign acknowledged a truth that became visible only after impact. Restraint systems are calibrated to assumptions about human dimensions. When assumptions fail, gravity does not adjust. Perilous Plunge. On the 21st of September 2001, 40-year-old Lori Mason Larez boarded Perilous Plunge, a water attraction that featured a record-breaking 115-foot drop at a steep 75-degree angle. At the time, the boats were equipped with individual lap bars and a standard seatbelt meant to secure riders across the waist. As the boat began its near-vertical descent, Mason Larez was thrown from her seat and ejected. Witnesses described the horrifying moment she fell approximately 100 feet from the chute, striking the water at the bottom before the boat itself made its splashdown. Investigators from the California Division of Occupational Safety and Health, DOSH, later determined that the restraint system did not mechanically fail or unlock. Instead, the design of the lap bar was insufficient for the victim's physical proportions, approximately 292 pounds. Because the lap bar could not be pulled down far enough to sit flush against her lap, a gap remained. When the boat hit the 75-degree angle of the drop, gravity and the sudden change in momentum caused her to slide through the opening between the seat and the restraint. The ride had opened only a year earlier and was marketed for its extreme intensity. The operational flaw was the assumption that a standard lap bar could safely secure all body types at such a steep vertical angle. Following the death of Lori Mason Larez, the ride was shut down for several months. Engineers completely overhauled the safety system, replacing the lap bars with 4 point-over-the-shoulder harnesses similar to those used in race cars. Despite these upgrades and increased safety protocols, the ride's reputation never fully recovered, and Perilous Plunge was permanently dismantled in 2012. Mindbender. On the 14th of June 1986, the final car of the Mindbender roller coaster derailed inside the West Edmonton Mall in Alberta, Canada. The indoor triple-loop coaster had been operating for months without major incident. During one cycle, as the train exited the third loop and entered a high-speed curve, the wheel assembly on the rear car detached, causing the car to fishtail and strike a concrete pillar. 3 passengers, David Sager, Tony Mandrusiak, and Cindy Chatterson, were killed instantly. A 4th rider in that car, Robert Chayko, survived with catastrophic, life-altering injuries. 19 others throughout the train sustained various injuries. The investigation focused not on dramatic structural collapse, but on a small mechanical component. A wheel assembly had been improperly maintained. Missing bolts and incorrect spacers allowed excess lateral movement between the train and the track. Over time, structural stress accumulated. On that day, the mechanical margin failed. Maintenance documentation was found to be incomplete, and inspection protocols were inconsistent. Replacement parts were not always installed according to German manufacturer specifications. The coaster itself was capable of safe operation. What failed was the adherence to routine mechanical discipline. After the derailment, the ride was closed for over a year and underwent a massive redesign. Wheel assemblies were modified to include extra safety bolts, and inspection schedules were strictly tightened. The coaster eventually reopened and continued operating for decades until its retirement in 2023. The derailment did not originate from an extreme design. It came from a gradual tolerance of deviation. Mechanical systems do not object when tolerances widen. They simply store the discrepancy until momentum applies the final, fatal force. Haunted Mind Drop. On the 5th of September 2021, 6-year-old Wangel Estefanos boarded the Haunted Mind Drop, an indoor FreeFall ride built inside a mountain in Colorado. The ride lifted passengers vertically before releasing them in a controlled drop. Wangel was seated next to family members. After the ride descended, she was found beneath the carriage. Investigators determined that she had slipped out from under the lap bar restraint during the drop. The restraint system was designed to accommodate a range of rider sizes. In this case, the bar had been adjusted to allow seating despite the child's smaller body dimensions. The ride's control system registered the restraint as locked. The failure was procedural rather than structural. Height and weight restrictions were in place, but enforcement depended on operator judgment. The restraint gap allowed sufficient space for downward movement during acceleration. There was no secondary shoulder harness. The ride was immediately closed and later dismantled. A settlement was reached with the family. The incident prompted renewed scrutiny of restraint calibration and ride operator training standards across smaller parks. The attraction had been marketed as the first underground drop tower in North America. Its uniqueness was architectural. Its vulnerability was mechanical tolerance combined with human discretion. Big Thunder Mountain. On the 5th of September 2003, 22-year-old Marcelo Torres boarded Big Thunder Mountain Railroad at Disneyland in California. The ride, themed as a runaway mine train, had operated for decades and was considered one of the park's flagship attractions. During the evening, as a train entered a dark tunnel section of the track, the locomotive assembly separated from the front passenger car. The sudden disruption caused the first passenger car to derail and strike the tunnel ceiling. Torres sustained critical internal injuries and later died at a hospital. Several other riders were seriously injured. The investigation did not identify a design flaw in the ride's concept. Instead, it focused on maintenance. A wheel assembly had been replaced during routine service prior to the incident. The retaining fasteners securing the locomotive to the lead car were not properly tightened to specification. Over time, vibration and operational stress caused the assembly to loosen further. When the train entered the tunnel at speed, the compromised connection failed. There was no visible warning for riders, no dramatic structural collapse. The system continued to operate as expected until a component that required exact torque did not meet its requirement. Disneyland closed the ride for months. Internal maintenance procedures were revised. Inspection documentation was strengthened. The park later reached a settlement with the victim's family. The ride had been marketed as controlled chaos. On that evening, the failure came from something far less theatrical, a fastening point that did not hold.